Hi, I'm Ched Myers. In this third segment, we're going to see how the vision of Sabbath economics extends from the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament, looking briefly at the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and also at some of the epistles in our Second Testament. About midway through this section, we're then going to change gears a little bit and begin to do some social analysis, looking at some of the more problematic aspects of our current economic culture as a way of transitioning now from ancient vision to modern practice. Let me just say a word about Jesus of Nazareth, who really stands in the line of the 8th century prophets. It's very clear, once we have recaptured Sabbath economics as a strand that is woven right into the heart of the fabric of the Hebrew Bible, then we start reading the Jesus story and we see echoes of it everywhere. So, for example, Isaiah's parable of the vineyard is a parable that Jesus takes and recontextualizes in a number of places, most significantly his own version of that parable that we find in Mark 12, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. And even his great metaphor in John's Gospel of the I am the vine and you are the branches is drawing off this ancient prophetic metaphor that encodes God's parabolic judgment on Israel. So whenever we see vineyard used metaphorically in the New Testament, we are supposed to be reminded of Isaiah's prophecy, which was a fundamental prophecy about Sabbath economic justice. We also see this in the Lord's Prayer. Now here's something that ought to be beloved to us in our churches. We recite it each Sunday. It ritualizes the memory of the manna in the wilderness. When Jesus says, give us today enough bread for the day, he's remembering the lesson of the manna. And that lesson was not just a Sunday school morality tale. It was a fundamental principle of economic equity. When Jesus goes into the wilderness and holds up bread, and that bread is distributed in a way that the hungry masses all have enough, that is Jesus' reenactment of the manna story. So it's very clear that Jesus of Nazareth, if not his contemporary followers, was deeply grounded in these stories of Sabbath economics. There's one story that we find in Mark's Gospel that is instructive because it alludes directly to the Sabbath economics principle of the remainder. You remember the story, Jesus is going through a grain field on the Sabbath, and the disciples are plucking heads of grain, and the local authorities challenge them, saying, why are you doing that which is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, it's not clear whether the authorities are concerned about working on the Sabbath or stealing grain. But in any case, as Jesus' defense will make clear, he's reasserting the right of people to glean. Look at his response. He says to them, I wonder if you remember the old story. Now, of course, he's talking to highly educated theologians, so when he says, have you never read that story about David, he's sort of tweaking them. Before David was king, it's when he was still running around in the wilderness trying to become king, and he and his men were hungry, and he entered a local sanctuary and took the showbread, the most sacred bread, from the inner sanctum of the sanctuary, and had that for a picnic. And the justification for doing this is, interestingly, not in the old story. It's something Jesus has added to the old story. David and his companions did that because they were hungry. The point Jesus is trying to make here is that hungry people have a right to food. And by so doing that, he is recapitulating the old Sabbath economics principle of the remainder. That is, the poor, the undocumented worker. These people have rights to the field. They have rights to your surplus. So he sums up the teaching with the phrase, the economy was made for humankind, not humankind for the economy. The human one is Lord even over the economy. Now, of course, you'll notice that I've substituted the term Sabbath there for the term economy. The text says the Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. But I hope by now you begin to get the sense that fundamentally in the biblical tradition, the tradition of Sabbath was a tradition of economic justice. So when we're talking about Sabbath, we're talking about economics. So we can rightly paraphrase that Jesus is making the point that the economy, principles of the economy are supposed to work for people. Once people are enslaved to an economy that's making some rich and others poor, then things are out of whack. This Jesus, as portrayed in the Gospels, is Lord even over economics. Now that would be news to most of our churches. But it is good news to the poor. And that is the tradition in which Jesus stands. In Luke 16, the entire chapter is structured in a way that tries to get at the problem of rich and poor. It starts out with the story of a rich man, and then it goes into a teaching about God and Mammon, and then goes into another attack on leaders as lovers of money, and then it ends with another story of a rich man. You notice how those two stories begin with exactly the same phrase. There was a rich man who. There was a rich man who. The second story, of course, is the famous story of Lazarus and dimes. These two stories of rich households are Jesus' attempt to use object lessons from the real economic terrain of his day to try to show his people how profoundly things had gotten out of whack. And these two object lessons are wrapped around his famous teaching about God and Mammon. Jesus uses this term Mammon. It's a very strange term. In rabbinic writings of the era, Mammon was used as an epithet for dishonest gain or even bribes. Sometimes, in fact, some translations of the Bible translate it filthy lucre. That's not a bad translation, actually, of the strange term Mammon. The term comes from an Aramaic term, which means that in which we trust. So look at Jesus' teaching in Luke 6:19 as a play on words. If then you have not been trustworthy in the unjust thing in which you trust, Mammon, who will entrust you with true abundance? What Jesus is trying to say to us, I believe here, is that we exist in the midst of an economy that, for the most part, doesn't work. It's profoundly contradicted. It's riddled with dishonesty and bribes and people having too much and people having too little. It is a mammon system, and we're sort of stuck with it. Therefore, we have to figure out a way to, in the midst of that mammon economy, practice the principles of Sabbath economics. Interestingly, by the way, mammon has deeper etymological roots in Babylonian mythology. In fact, it may have stemmed from Manman, the ancient name of the god of hell. Even as we struggle in an economy of mammon to work, Jesus is very clear. No householder, he says, can be bound in service, enslaved to two masters. Either she will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. This is one of these texts of terror in the New Testament, isn't it? That we do everything in our power to silence or marginalize or trivialize or spiritualize. And yet here it is. Jesus is saying very clearly, we are involved, friends, in our historic moment, as he was in his, in a life and death struggle between the economy of Mammon and the economy of Manna. And Jesus is trying to tell us that our loyalties need to be very, very clear. To again quote the great Baptist with Kentucky roots, Clarence Jordan, he didn't say you shouldn't serve God and Mammon. He says you can't. That's Jesus perhaps at his toughest. And it is a tradition we have to reckon with. And many of us good Presbyterians would like to take refuge in the Apostle Paul if Jesus is too hard, because surely Paul is the patron saint of our beloved Mammon economy, but unfortunately for us, we find Sabbath economics even in the Apostle Paul. The one thing he talks about consistently in every epistle that he writes is a transnational program of economic redistribution he's simply called the collection. And his most detailed rationale for the collection project that he took all over Asia Minor, we find in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where he describes the collection as the work of grace. He uses the term charis, grace, some 9 times in this chapter. And he's talking to a church that has a little bit more, that would be the Corinthian church, about a church that has considerably less, that would be the Palestinian church at the time. And he's trying to get the wealthier church to practice Sabbath economics and wealth redistribution with the poorer church. And their objection, which they don't voice, but he can hear them thinking it, is that, well, if we give some of what we have to them, then they'll have and we won't have. And so we'll have just transferred the problem. That's sort of a disingenuous way in which all of us who have too much justify hanging on to it, is it not? And look at Paul's answer to that. He says, I don't mean that there should be relief for others in order to put pressure on you. This is a question of equality between your present abundance and their need, so that somewhere down the line, their abundance might be available for your need in order that there be equality. Do you see the 2 principles of Sabbath economics working here? Principle number 1 is everyone should have enough. Principle number 2, if we keep this thing circulating, then at a time I have a little more, I can help you out, because down the line you might have a little more and you can help me out. It's a principle of equality. Actually, the term equality doesn't come up much in the Apostle Paul, but it comes up here. And then of all the scriptural justifications Paul could give for the collection, guess which one he uses? It is, you guessed it, the story of the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, says Paul, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. And so we've come full circle from Torah through the prophets, Jesus of Nazareth, even the Apostle Paul. This principle is also found in the book of James, where he sounds a lot like Isaiah or Amos or Jeremiah, in which he excoriates the wealthy in his society who exploit their laborers, who live in luxury, fattening their hearts for the day of slaughter, and end up murdering the just people. Well, that stuff doesn't necessarily preach in our churches, so maybe it's better to use Paul. In any case, the point is that Sabbath economics narrative runs throughout the entire tradition of Scripture from beginning to end. We see it in Torah legislation. We see it in prophetic oracles. We see it in Jesus' teaching and in his actions. We see it in Paul and James. This is not, friends, a marginal tradition in our Bible. It is, in fact, a central tradition, but it has been marginalized in our church's teaching. Part of the project of our work here is to try to bring that tradition back into the center and then to begin asking ourselves, what does this mean? So to return to the question about what Sabbath economics is, I guess we could sum it up this way. It is the personal and political struggle to embody a culture of manna in the midst of a culture of mammon. If you're interested in the biblical underpinnings of this and how it runs throughout Scripture, we've got the green book called The Biblical Vision of Sabbath Economics. There are also resources on the web. There's a Sabbath Economics Collaborative, a group of theologians and scholars and economists who are trying to work on revisioning this rehabilitation of an old economic story that also happens to be our sacred story in our churches, and to bring it into vigorous conversation with the economic story of capitalism, which is in crisis. And that seems to be a good evangelical project for our churches to be involved with in these days. what we want to do is to now take the step to do a little bit of reflection on our own social context here in the Mammon economy. Ferdinand Tönnies was one of the great of the late 19th century sociologists who, like Max Weber and Engels and Marx and others, who all were trying to understand the way in which modern market economies and industrialization were changing the face and the character of human society. Because industrialization in the 19th century had a huge impact on the landscapes of Europe and certainly of the United States as well. These sociologists were trying to figure out what this meant for both individual and particularly for collective human life. And he made a very interesting distinction in his work between what he called Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. One which means community, the other which is often translated society. And this is the way he defined these terms. That community can be defined by everything that holds human relationships together despite all that which would pull them apart. That's community. So if you think of the community of family, no matter what the political or economic or even personality tensions are, there are strong bonds that hold people together, despite the fact that unemployment might be pulling the family apart, or displacement, or poverty. So that's Gemeinschaft, that's community, that's deep human social bonds. He said we also have to talk in terms of Gesellschaft, and he flips the definition. He says Gesellschaft is everything that would pull human relationships apart despite that which holds them together. And the reason he felt the need to talk about that is he saw clans and villages and families and neighborhoods systematically dismantled by the powerful forces of modern industrial capitalism, in which formerly a local clan or an agrarian village or an extended family was over 2 or 3 generations displaced, dismantled, first taking the man out of the home and putting him in a factory, and then later in the 20th century also taking the woman out of the home and putting her in the workplace, through geographical migrations that were economically driven. So many forces that were pulling people apart despite everything organically, despite the Gemeinschaft that would hold them together. And I think that is an instructive shorthand way of talking about the two forces of Manna economics, which gives a high priority to human solidarity and to human interrelationship and to mutual aid and to caring for one another. And a Mammon economics, which is about quick profit and accumulation, despite the impact that might have on human solidarity. Now, to get a little deeper into this, I want to just do a short exercise with you, which we've done with groups before. These are 5 core characteristics of what some modern social commentators have called McWorld, or the sort of hyper-modern social landscape. And I want to go through them just one at a time and ask you to generate some examples. In the first instance, one of the things, obviously, which we've already talked about, is the process of stratification of wealth, polarization of wealth, and of power. What some have called triage economics, in which some folk there's not enough for everybody, and so some folk are just going to be triaged, and that would be the poor. Now, what are some of the ways in which you see this in your local area? What are some of the ways in which you see the polarization of wealth? We're just going to generate a few examples. A second characteristic that we could name would be the dismantling of the Commonwealth by privatization. Now, what do we mean by that? What might be some examples of that? What is something that sort of used to belong to the public but has been privatized? Here's a third characteristic of Gesellschaft in McWorld. The dispossession of the local by the global. Now, a man by the name of Daniel Kemmis, who is one of the more interesting social thinkers of our time, who wrote a book called Community and the Politics of Place, used to be the mayor of Montana, calls this the difference between having a marketplace where you know the people and they know you, and you have a general sense of where things come from, and placeless markets where you shop for stuff, you have no idea where it's from, you have no idea how it got to you, and you don't care, you just want to make sure you get it for cheap. And you can buy it without ever having to interact with anybody, because you can buy it online. That would be his example of a placeless market. What would be examples of the dispossession of local marketplaces with sort of the phenomenon of big box placeless markets? A fourth characteristic, and we could talk a lot about any one of these, is the eclipse of use value by exchange value. This is something that Karl Marx called commodity fetishism, and what he meant by that is the way in which a manufactured product takes on a magical life which has the power to make us happy or to heal us or give us sex appeal. So no longer is it just a razor to shave with, but it's a magical wand that will somehow get you a date. It's no longer just a vehicle to get you from point A to point B. It's a muscular, magical Mustang, which makes you feel better about yourself. This process is well advanced in our culture, and we are all deeply shaped by it. Anybody want to give an example that comes to your mind that is particularly problematic? And finally, the atrophy of the communal and the sovereignty of the individual. That's, I think, again, pretty obvious. But what are some of the ways in which things that used to be sort of done collectively or, as a whole in the household are being increasingly privatized? So when Tönnies talks about the forces which pull people apart despite everything that would otherwise hold them together, these are the kinds of forces he's talking about. And they are ubiquitous in our lives. They're inside us, they're around us, they determine the landscape, they determine especially our economic habits. Now, we talked about the three pathologies of affluenza, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just to name them briefly. When we have too much, we're constantly riddled by anxiety. Even though we have too much, we doubt that there will be enough. So we're constantly haunted by the specter of scarcity. Artificial abundance creates artificial scarcity. We believe that artificial abundance and artificial scarcity are natural, but actually they're engineered states. What we mean by that is you walk into a supermarket and there's artificial abundance. But with that artificial abundance, there's artificial scarcity in other parts of the society that might make people so poor. Some neighborhoods are so poor they don't have the supermarkets. They have to get on a bus and drive a long way or go down to the last remaining little liquor store to buy their toothpaste. So we're constantly living in fear of not enoughness. Or we're dissatisfied. We're just constantly trying to get a better job, a better car, a little bit more money, newer set of clothes, a little bit better computer, that kind of thing. This is constant, preying on us constantly, particularly through advertising. And because of our doubt that's fed by our dissatisfaction, we back our way into a lifestyle of deficit spending, where in order to get stuff we don't need, but we desire, in order to feed our dissatisfaction or solve our doubt, we begin to accumulate debt because we're spending more than we're making. This is a common issue for young and old alike in this economy. And all of that plays into this epidemic of anxiety. There's a reason why we are a Prozac nation. We are in an economy that constantly makes us anxious. If we have a job, we're worried about keeping a job or getting a better job. If we don't have a job, we're worried about getting a job, and so on. So that's anxiety, and we again could talk a lot more about that. We also live in a society in which the factors of alienation really are ubiquitous. We're alienated from community. One of the ways we see this in the United States today is tomorrow afternoon, everybody's going to sidle up around the television and root really hard for a team that really doesn't care about you. That sense of false identity. I'm a Steelers fan, and maybe that's practically speaking as important to me as being a Presbyterian. Now, not that we'd ever admit that, but believe me, we had to cancel one of these workshops that was scheduled at a Presbyterian church tomorrow afternoon because of conflict with the Super Bowl. So I'm thinking there's an issue there. We're alienated from Commonwealth for the kinds of things that we talked about. We're alienated from work. A lot of us work in jobs that aren't necessarily satisfying or life-giving to us. But we need to keep the job so we can keep the money flowing so that we can buy stuff we don't need. We're obviously alienated from the earth. We could spend the whole day talking about all the ways in which we're estranged from nature. And the attitude that we've all inherited from capitalism, that nature has no intrinsic value except insofar as we re-engineer it into something economically useful. So hills must become condominiums, forests must become board feet, rivers must become hydroelectric gigawatts in order to have value in our society. We're alienated from place. We talked a little bit about the placelessness, the mobility. How many of you, we'll just take a quick poll here, how many of you today live within 5 miles of where you were born? One person. That gives you an idea. Now, 200 years ago, 90% of us would have raised our hand. This is just in 200 years that this completely turned on its head. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about our alienation from place. We are alienated from relational commerce, right? The local mom and pop store, knowing where our stuff comes from. And this ought to concern us in our church, we're alienated from the Spirit. The aggressive secularization and the aggressive materialism makes us constantly anxious about our relationship with stuff, and our relationship with work, and our relationship with money. So that at church, we have to fight for a couple of hours a week to refocus on a life of the Spirit, or an inner life, or a relational life of community. So, anxiety, alienation, and not to be missed, addiction. I was very interested. I'm a baseball fan, all right? I'm not a Dodgers fan. I'm a baseball fan. I just think it's a great game. And baseball last year was rocked by a steroid scandal. And I was reading some commentary around that, at how ho-hum of a story that was for most Americans. Several commentators made the point that people just sort of shrugged that ball players were using steroids because we're a nation of addicts. and pumping ourselves up with something artificial to perform better, whether it's high energy drink or caffeine or steroids, that's just what we do. And I think that's sort of a parable of where we are as a culture, that an artificial stimulant or an artificial depressant to get us higher or bring us down is so much woven into our culture that we have become a nation of addicts. We're addicted to limitlessness. Now, we don't usually think of that as an addiction, but friends, the definition of addiction is the inability to stop. And so if we cannot draw boundaries and make limits, whether that's limits to work or limits to stuff or limits to money or limits to our distractions, then we are addicts. We're addicted to limitlessness, we're addicted to money, we're addicted to stuff, and we're addicted to work. These are all aspects of a society of affluenza, which in turn is the result of the dynamics of Gesellschaft. We are so separated from the things that hold us together that we need addictions to just hold our soul together. So one of the premises of the work that we do here in Sabbath Economics is the addiction recovery model. We think it's one of the most powerful diagnostic and healing tools that has grown out of our culture. That insofar as we are a nation of addicts, insofar as our economic behavior is addictive, then we need to pay very close attention both to the cycle of addiction and to the disciplines of recovery. This is all a little depressing, I realize, but we're talking about the world we know, and the world we have a somewhat ambivalent relationship with. Our inability to separate ourselves from some of its most destructive behavior is the result of our attachment to it. Attachment is one of the definitions of addiction. So to try to get at this, we have developed what we call a household Sabbath economics covenant.